Number 1. The Antler-Skull Shamans of Carr. Carr, in what is now North Yorkshire, was occupied from roughly 11,000 to 10,700 years ago at the close of the last Ice Age. Excavations begun by Graham Clark between 1949 and 1951 and reopened by Nicky Milner from 2004 onward have recovered 21 red deer skull headdresses. That is more than every other Mesolithic site in Europe combined. Each skull was carefully modified for a human wearer. The cranium was thinned from the inside. The antlers were shortened. 2 large holes were drilled through the parietal bones, threaded with leather or sinew straps that could be tied under the chin. Microscopic wear patterns on the interior surfaces indicate the skulls were worn repeatedly. These were not one-use ceremonial objects. They were the regalia of a caste. The red deer they came from were not scavenged from carcasses found in the forest. Bone chemistry analysis shows the stags were mature, healthy, and deliberately selected. Parallel evidence exists from the cave painting known as the Sorcerer of Trois Frères in France, drawn approximately 14,000 years ago. It depicts a figure that is half human and half stag, dancing. 3 main interpretations compete. The mainstream position, advanced by Ian Hodder, holds that the antler skulls were shamanic regalia. The wearer entered a trance state and became possessed by the animal spirit. A revisionist position, defended by Chantal Connelaire of the University of Manchester, argues that the headdresses were practical hunting camouflage. A third view, drawing on comparative anthropology, sees the 2 functions as inseparable. The shaman's trance was also the hunter's method. To become the deer was to catch the deer. The practice did not die at Carr. The Abbott's Bromley horn dance in Staffordshire, England, performed annually to this day, uses reindeer antlers that have been carbon dated to around the year 10865. The Celtic horned god Cernunnos, the Norse horned helmet tradition, the Greek satyr myth, and the Christmas reindeer all carry the Mesolithic imprint. Walk into any costume shop today. Among the plastic masks and rubber claws, you are looking at the direct descendants of those 21 drilled skulls. What the shamans treated as a religious technology for animal spirit possession has become, 10,000 years later, a child's trick-or-treat disguise. The ritual logic survived. The belief did not. And on every Krampusnacht parade in the alpine villages of Austria and South Tyrol, men still strap horned wooden masks to their heads and become the beast. They are not the oldest such descendants, however. For that, we have to travel south and 600 years further back in time. Number 2. Göbekli Tepe's Vulture Excarnation Pillars. On a limestone ridge near the modern city of Şanlıurfa in what is now southeastern Turkey, something unprecedented is being built. T-shaped pillars of limestone, some as tall as 5.5 meters and weighing up to 16 tons, are being erected in stone circles. They are carved in relief with foxes, snakes, scorpions, wild boars, and most hauntingly, vultures. Göbekli Tepe was discovered in 1963 but not properly excavated until 1994, when the German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt began the investigation that continued until his death in 2014. The site is between 11,600 and 8,200 years old. It predates agriculture in the region by several centuries. Schmidt's discovery overturned a century-old assumption. Temples, it turned out, did not require farming surpluses to be built. The temple came first. Look at Pillar 43 in what Schmidt labeled Enclosure D. A giant vulture is carved in profile holding what appears to be a severed human head in the form of a disc. Beneath it lies a headless human body. A scorpion waits nearby. The imagery is not ambiguous. Archaeozoological analysis published by Gresky, Helm, and Clare in 2017 demonstrated cut marks on human bone fragments found across the site, consistent with deliberate defleshing. 3 skulls were recovered that had been modified post-mortem with carved grooves and drilled holes, suggesting they had been suspended and displayed. The evidence points toward Excarnation. Bodies were exposed to be stripped clean, possibly by vultures, then the skulls were kept and venerated. All around the pillars, archaeologists found enormous quantities of animal bone, gazelle, aurochs, wild sheep, feasting debris. The communities who built Göbekli Tepe gathered there in large numbers, eating while their dead were processed nearby. Research by Dietrich and colleagues in 2012 identified traces of fermented grain in stone troughs at the site. This may be the earliest evidence of brewing anywhere in the world. They drank beer at their funerals. 3 interpretations dominate. The Excarnation feast view, argued by Schmidt and his successors, treats Göbekli Tepe as a regional necropolis where the dead were brought for ritual processing. A second view associated with Leclerc emphasizes the site's role as a pilgrimage center for pre-agricultural hunter-gatherer confederations. A third, more speculative reading draws on the Zoroastrian Towers of Silence and proposes that Göbekli Tepe is the ultimate ancestor of all sky burial traditions from Tibet to Iran. The Towers of Silence, the Dokma, are the purest surviving descendants. So is the Tibetan Buddhist Jotter, where the body is offered to vultures as a final act of generosity. But the more everyday descendants are with us constantly. The Irish wake, where grief and heavy drinking are mixed at the open casket. The Jewish Shiva, the Catholic funeral reception. Every community that metabolizes a death by eating together is doing what the builders of Göbekli Tepe did. The pillars are buried now, deliberately filled in with rubble around 8,200 years ago, but their logic is still served at every reception hall in the modern world, and the dead have been dressed for display far longer than anyone realized. Number 3. The Red Lady of Paviland. In 1823, an Oxford clergyman and geologist named William Buckland climbed into a sea cave on the Gower Peninsula in South Wales. The cave is called Goat's Hole, reached only at low tide by a difficult scramble. Inside, Buckland uncovered a human skeleton stained deep red, surrounded by mammoth ivory, perforated shells, and the skull of a mammoth placed near the head of the body. Buckland was a creationist. His book Reliquiae Diluvianae, published the same year, argued that fossils were evidence of the biblical flood. He identified the skeleton as a Roman-era female, probably a prostitute associated with the nearby hill fort. The name stuck. She has been the Red Lady of Paviland ever since, but she is not a lady, and she is not Roman. Radiocarbon dating by Tom Himes' team at Oxford in 2007 revised the age to approximately 33,000 calibrated years before present. That makes Paviland the oldest known ritual burial in Western Europe. The skeleton is male, a young man of around 21 years, 1.7 meters tall. He died without obvious violence. Stable isotope analysis showed his diet was heavy in fish and marine resources, unusual for the period. The red staining was not painted on living flesh. The distribution across the bones and into the surrounding sediment reveals that the body was wrapped or packed in red ochre after death. The ochre itself was sourced from deposits several kilometers inland and deliberately transported to the cave. Alongside the body were perforated periwinkle shells, likely strung as beads, and ivory rods carved from mammoth tusk, interpreted variously as hair ornaments, ritual wands, or clothing fasteners. Paviland is not alone. The Sungir burials in Russia, dated to around 34,000 years ago, include 2 children lying head-to-head, covered in thousands of carved ivory beads. The triple burial at Dolní Věstonice in Czechia from 27,000 years ago shows 3 young adults arranged in a deliberate pose, all coated in ochre. The Lagar Velho child in Portugal, 24,500 years old, was buried with what appears to be a Neanderthal modern human hybrid morphology, and similarly dusted in red. Red ochre burials are older still. At Blombos Cave in South Africa, Christopher Henshelwood's team recovered a 100,000-year-old ochre processing kit, including a pair of abalone shells containing ground red pigment. The practice of coloring corpses red predates our species' arrival in Europe. 3 theories coexist. The symbolic blood theory, the oldest and most widely accepted, holds that red ochre represents lifeblood, menstrual blood, or birth blood. A practical preservative theory argued by some biochemists notes that ochre has insecticidal and antibacterial properties and may have been used simply to delay decomposition. A third view sees ochre burial as evidence of a continuous ritual tradition running unbroken from Africa through Neanderthals and into modern human culture. Modern Hindu cremation dresses the body in saffron or red cloth. Jewish tahara, Islamic ghusl, Christian body washing all involve preparing the corpse with ritualized materials. Victorian codification made black the Western mourning color, but older European traditions preferred deep reds and purples. The open casket, the dressed and presented body, the insistence that the dead must be prepared before they can be released is the Paviland logic intact. 33,000 years later, we still insist on coloring the dead before we let them go. But some ancestors did not release their dead into the earth. They sent them somewhere stranger. Number 4. The bog body ritual drownings. In May of 1950, 2 peat cutters in Silkeborg, Denmark, discovered a man curled on his side in the bog. His stubble was still on his chin, his eyes were closed. A braided leather noose was pulled tight around his neck. At first, the cutters called the police, assuming they had found a recent murder victim. They were off by about 2,400 years. Tulundman has been dated to between 405 and 380 BC. He is one of approximately 1,000 bog bodies recovered from the peat wetlands of northern Europe, concentrated between about 8,000 years ago and the early medieval period, with the densest period falling between 500 BC and 100 AD. The peat's anaerobic and acidic conditions preserve soft tissue with extraordinary fidelity. Tulundman's fingerprints are still readable. Several of these bodies tell a consistent story. Lindoman, found in Cheshire, England in 1984, died sometime between 2 BC and 119 AD. He suffered what forensic archaeologists call the triple death: a blow to the back of the skull, a garrote tightened around the neck, a knife wound to the throat. Any one of these would have killed him. All 3 were applied. Grauballeman, a Dane from around 300 BC, had his throat cut ear to ear while still alive. The blood pooling pattern confirms the order. Widugirl, from what is now the Netherlands, was 16 years old when she was stabbed in the throat and strangled. The triple death pattern rules out ordinary execution. Criminal killings do not overkill victims with 3 distinct methods. This was ritual. The Danish archaeologist P.V. Glob, in his 1969 book The Bog People, established the sacrificial interpretation that remains the scholarly consensus. These people were offerings. Their stomach contents reveal ritualized last meals. Tulundman ate a porridge of barley, flax, knotweed, and chamomile 12 to 24 hours before his death. Several victims show ergot-contaminated grain in their final meals, which would have produced hallucinations and convulsions. Others show evidence of elevated social status, including manicured nails and hands that had never performed manual labor. These were not criminals. They were chosen. 3 interpretations compete. The sacrificial offering theory, the mainstream position, holds that bog victims were gifts to wetland deities offered during times of crisis or at calendar festivals. A criminal punishment theory based on the Roman historian Tacitus's 1st century claim that Germanic tribes drowned cowards, shirkers, and sodomites in bogs treats the bodies as executions. A third theory sees the triple death as evidence of a sacred kingship tradition in which a ruler was sacrificed to renew the land's fertility. Whatever the specific logic, the bog itself was the key. In the Iron Age European cosmology, bogs were liminal. They were neither land nor water, neither living nor dead. The perfect threshold to the other world. That threshold logic did not vanish. Christian baptism immerses the convert in water as a symbolic death. The old self drowns, a new self rises. Hindu ritual bathing at the cremation ghats of Varanasi operates on the same cosmology. The Jewish mikveh, the Muslim ghusl, the medieval trial by water, where suspected witches were bound and thrown in to see if they sank. Every water ritual that marks a passage between states of being is a softer descendant of Tulundman's noose, and on some bodies the rituals were written more literally, in ink pressed into cut skin. Number 5. Ötzi's copper dust tattoos. In September of 1991, a pair of German tourists walking in the Ötztal Alps on the Austrian-Italian border spotted a body half protruding from melting glacier ice. They assumed it was a recent climbing accident. It was not. The body was approximately 5,300 years old. Ötzi the Iceman carries 61 tattoos. They are the oldest confirmed tattoos on a preserved human body. They cluster on his lower back, his knees and ankles, and his right wrist. Their designs are simple and geometric, parallel lines, cross shapes, no representational imagery. The technique was not tattooing as we practice it today. Modern tattoos are made by puncturing skin with a needle and driving ink into the dermis. Ötzi's tattoos were made differently. Fine incisions were cut into the skin with a sharp blade. Charcoal mixed with small amounts of copper particles was rubbed into the open wounds. The ink fused with the scar tissue as the incision healed. The method is sometimes called cut-and-rub tattooing, and it is painful, slow, and carries a serious infection risk. It is also structurally identical to the tattooing method still practiced in traditional Polynesian and Maori contexts. Raman spectroscopy and analysis confirms the pigment is primarily fireplace soot, the same carbon black material used in tattoo inks today. The copper content was likely incidental, picked up from contact with copper-age metalworking tools. Ötzi did not die of his tattoos, he died violently. An arrowhead lodged in his left shoulder severed a major artery. A blow to the back of his head finished him. He was approximately 45 years old. A second individual's blood was found on his knife and on one of his arrows, suggesting he had killed or wounded someone shortly before his own death. 3 theories explain the tattoos. The therapeutic theory, published in Science by Dorfer and Moser in 1999, observed that approximately 80% of Ötzi's tattoos align with anatomically recognized acupuncture meridians, and that their placement corresponds to areas of joint degeneration visible in his skeleton. This makes them a form of proto-acupuncture. A second theory, argued by Samadelli and colleagues in 2015, treats the tattoos as shamanic markings with secondary medical associations. A third view proposes that tattoos, therapy, and shamanism were not separable categories in Copper Age cognition. Tattooing did not begin with Ötzi. Needles and ochre residues at the Grotte du Rennes in France have been dated to around 35,000 years ago. The Chinchorro mummies of Chile bear facial tattoos from 7,000 years ago. The Ukok princess of Siberia, buried around 2,400 years ago, carries elaborate mythological beast imagery across her arms. In Europe, the practice was violently suppressed. The Roman Emperor Constantine banned facial tattoos in 316 AD. The Council of Northumberland condemned tattooing outright in 787 AD. For over 1,000 years, tattoos in Christian Europe survived only in sailor underworlds, criminal fraternities, and military contexts. The modern resurgence began in the 1970s counterculture. Samuel O'Reilly's 1891 invention of the electric tattoo machine industrialized the process, but the underlying principle, breaking the skin and filling the wound with carbon pigment, is unchanged from Ötzi. A 2023 Pew survey found 32% of American adults have at least one tattoo. Every one of them is wearing the Iceman's ink. Ötzi's marked skin was his alone, but other bodies were bound to each other. Number 6. Celtic handfasting with sinew cord. Walk through almost any Celtic or Germanic farming community of 2,000 years ago, at the hour when 2 families are bringing a young couple together. The slaughter has already happened. A bull or a horse was ritually killed earlier in the day. Its flesh will feed the wedding feast, its hide will make leather. But first, a specific part of the animal is being taken. Strips of sinew, the strong fibrous tendons that ran along the back of the beast, are being washed and softened and braided into a cord. The cord is brought to the couple. They stand facing each other, their right wrists joined. The druid, or the elder, or the local priestess, winds the sinew cord around their wrists in a figure 8 pattern and ties the final knot. The marriage has been made. The phrase tying the knot is documented in English print from the 13th century. Its oral use is older. Handfasting appears in the Irish Brehon Laws, compiled in written form in the 7th and 8th centuries, but preserving substantially older customary law. In its Celtic legal form, the union was provisional. It lasted 1 year and 1 day. After that, the couple could formalize the bond permanently or dissolve it without stigma. Samuel Pepys' diary from the 17th century records handfasting as still legally recognized in Scotland. Mary Queen of Scots' wedding to Francis II of France in 1558 included handfasting elements. The practice was formally ended by the Scottish Marriage Act of 1939, closing a legal tradition that had lasted more or less continuously for over 2,000 years. 3 interpretations of the sinew's meaning coexist. The practical view treats sinew as simply the strongest natural fiber available in pre-metal cultures. Bowstrings, bindings, stitched leather all used sinew. A bride and groom bound with it were bound well. A symbolic view treats the sinew as a sympathetic magic conduit. The cord carried the life force of the sacrificed animal into the marriage. A third view sees the sinew as a blood bond substitute. a way of joining two individuals with a third living substance between them. The cord-binding wedding ritual is not exclusive to Celtic Europe. Roman weddings included the dextrarum iunctio, the clasping of right hands, a parallel gesture with likely shared Indo-European roots. The Hindu Granthi Bandhan ties the bride's and groom's garments together with a knotted cloth. In Mexican and Filipino Catholic weddings, a figure-8 loop of cord called the lazo is placed over the couple during the ceremony. It is the Celtic handfasting knot, preserved through Spanish colonialism. Jewish weddings include the bride's 7 circles around the groom and the Vatican veiling ceremony, different rituals built on the same Indo-European template. After the near disappearance of handfasting in the early 20th century, the ritual was revived by Gerald Gardner's Wiccan movement in the 1940s and 50s. Approximately 15% of modern United Kingdom weddings now include a handfasting element. Celtic triple knot and trinity knot designs in the Book of Kells, illuminated around 800 AD, preserve the visual grammar of the handfasting cord in decorative form. The claddagh ring, appearing in 17th century Ireland, compresses the ritual into wearable metal. The wedding ring itself, the unbroken circle placed on the finger, is the distant descendant of the cord. Every ring exchange is a knot tied. Every vow sealed with the band repeats the gesture made with sacrifice Sinew 2 millennia ago. The binding of two people was one annual rite. The renewal of the land itself was another. Number 7. The Maypole Fertility Rite. At the end of April, on the cross-quarter day halfway between the spring equinox and the summer solstice, pre-Christian Europe erected its poles. In Celtic tradition, the festival was called Beltane. In Germanic tradition, Walpurgisnacht. In Roman tradition, Floralia. The pole, wrapped in greenery at its peak and streaming with colored ribbons, was planted in the village green or the cleared meadow. It was unambiguously phallic. The dancers, holding the ribbons, wove them around the pole in interlacing patterns. The weaving was sex. The first explicit written reference to a maypole in Britain appears in a 14th century Welsh poem by Griffith ap Ada ap Adafyd, describing a pole in Llanidloes. The Roman Floralia festival, held from April 27th through May 3rd in honor of the goddess Flora, involved phallic pole processions, sexual license, and masked revelry. It is documented in Ovid's Fasti, written around the year 8 AD. The Celtic festival of Beltane, meaning bright fire in Old Irish, drove cattle between two bonfires for ritual purification and featured mass handfastings. Walpurgisnacht, the Germanic equivalent, was held on the night of April 30th. James Fraser's The Golden Bough, published in volumes between 1890 and 1915, identified the maypole as the descendant of prehistoric tree spirit veneration. Sir John Rees, in 1901, argued it represented the axis mundi, the world tree connecting underworld, earth, and sky. 3 interpretations remain in tension. The fertility ritual view treats the pole as a phallic fertility symbol and the ribbon weaving as a ritualized act of generation. A more conservative historical view notes that surviving maypole traditions are medieval rather than prehistoric, and cautions against reading deep pagan meanings into customs that may be only a few hundred years old. A third view, associated with Fraser and Margaret Murray and controversial in mainstream archaeology, holds that in deep prehistory the festival involved the ritual sacrifice of a May king at its conclusion. In Fraser's reconstruction, the king was chosen for the year, honored, sexually paired with a May queen, and then killed, to guarantee the fertility of the harvest. The festival was politically dangerous enough to be banned. The Long Parliament in England prohibited maypoles in 1644, specifically citing their pagan sexual associations. The ban was reversed at the Restoration in 1660. Puritan New England attempted and largely failed to erase the festival in the colonies. A Welsh tradition called Congan Haf, the summer branch, saw a decorated bough carried from house to house on May morning. Surviving ritual combat dances, the Morris dancing tradition of sword and stick routines, preserve what may be older fertility through combat customs. The Padstow Obby Os Festival in Cornwall, still performed every May 1st, features a costumed hobby horse that chases young women through the streets. The Helston Furry Dance, also in Cornwall, preserves an unbroken May procession documented from the 1790s. International Workers' Day, placed on May 1st by the Second International in 1889, was deliberately chosen to align with the pagan Beltane, capturing the day's ancient disruptive energy for the labor movement. Modern Wiccan celebrations of Beltane consciously revive the fertility ritual core. German villages still steal each other's Maibaume as a ritualized neighborly conflict, a survival of inter-village Beltane raiding. The green man foliate head motif, carved into medieval European cathedrals from Kilpick in Herefordshire to Bamberg in Germany, preserves the vegetative spirit that the Maypole embodied in material form. He is watching from the masonry above every Christian congregation that thought it had replaced him. The spring festival kept the crops alive. The autumn festival kept the dead from becoming hostile. Number 8. Samhain's Turnip Head Lanterns. On the night of October 31st, at the Celtic quarter day of Samhain, the veil was at its thinnest. The dead returned. They walked the roads, they visited their old homes, they expected to be fed. And in the doorways of Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, something was waiting for them. A turnip, or sometimes a mangel-wurzel, or a beet. Hollowed out, carved with a grotesque face, a candle burning inside. Its purpose was double. The grimacing face would frighten off hostile spirits. The light inside represented the souls of the dead caught between worlds. Samhain, meaning summer's end in Old Irish, marked the cross-quarter day between the autumn equinox and the winter solstice. It was one of the 4 great quarter days of the Celtic agricultural and religious calendar, alongside Imbolc, Beltane, and Lugnasad. The earliest written Irish reference appears in the 10th century Toshmark Mir, though the festival is far older. It marked the end of the harvest and the beginning of winter. In Celtic cosmology, this was when the boundary between the living and the dead became porous. The Celtic head cult adds a darker dimension. The Greek historians Posidonius, writing in the 1st century BC, and Diodorus Siculus, writing in the same period, both described Celtic warriors who collected their enemies' heads, embalmed them in cedar oil, and kept them displayed in their homes. The archaeological site of Roquepertus in southern France, dating to the 3rd century BC, contains skull niches where human heads were mounted on display. The turnip carving tradition preserves this in miniature and in vegetable form. A hollow head with fire inside is a skull with a soul. 3 theories of the tradition's evolution coexist. The direct descent view treats the turnip lantern as a continuous ritual from Celtic head cult through medieval Catholicism into modern Halloween. A diffusion view sees the modern practice as primarily medieval, with the Celtic layer present but thinner. A third view, advanced by folklorists like Ronald Hutton, argues that many specific ancient Samhain practices were reconstructed or invented in the Victorian era, though the underlying festival structure is genuinely old. The name jack-o'-lantern comes from an Irish folk tale about a trickster called Stingy Jack. Jack cheated the devil, was refused entry to both heaven and hell, and was condemned to wander the earth forever with only a burning coal carried inside a hollowed turnip. The Christian Church, responding to the persistent festival, moved All Saints' Day to November 1st in the 9th century under Pope Gregory IV. All Souls' Day followed on November 2nd. Souling, the practice of going from door to door offering prayers for the dead in exchange for small cakes, is documented in medieval England and is the direct ancestor of trick-or-treat. When Irish immigrants fled the Great Famine between 1845 and 1852, they brought the tradition to North America. The pumpkin, native to the Americas and far larger and softer than a turnip, replaced the Old World root. The earliest documented American pumpkin jack-o'-lanterns appear in New England in the 1860s. Modern American Halloween generates approximately $12 billion in annual retail sales. The skull iconography, the costumes, the carved faces, the threshold offerings, the door-to-door procession are structurally identical to Samhain 2,000 years ago. Dia de los Muertos in Mexico preserves the same indigenous Catholic Samhain period logic. Every child who carves a pumpkin is practicing a 2,000-year-old spirit-warding rite, even if they think they are only making a face. 6 months later, the same villages were decorating a different object with different meaning. Number 9. The Pagan Spring Egg Rite. At the spring equinox, on or around March 20th, pre-Christian Europe placed eggs on altars. Some were painted, some were dyed red, some were hollowed and inscribed. All were fertility objects. In Zoroastrian Persia, they were arranged on the Haftzin table for Novruz. In ancient Egypt, painted ostrich eggs were placed in tombs. In Germanic Europe, they were offered to the spring goddess Eostri. In Slavic lands, they were decorated with intricate wax-resist patterns called paisanki. The spring egg ritual is arguably the most geographically widespread and continuous fertility custom in the world. The earliest reference to Eostri comes from the Venerable Bede, writing in England in 725 AD. His text De Temporum Ratione identifies her as a Germanic goddess whose festival had been celebrated in the month corresponding to April and whose name was absorbed into the Anglo-Saxon word for Easter. The 19th century German folklorist Jacob Grimm, in his Deutsche Mythologie of 1835, reconstructed a more elaborate version of the goddess under the name Ostara. Modern scholars are divided on how much of Grimm's Ostara is Germanic and how much is Grimm. What is clear is that the spring egg tradition predates Christianity and Germanic paganism alike. Painted ostrich eggs have been recovered from Egyptian 5th dynasty tombs dating to approximately 2400 BC. Ukrainian paisanki designs preserve pre-Christian Slavic symbology. The Orthodox Christian practice of dyeing Easter eggs red, common across Greece, Russia, Romania, and the Balkans, is explicitly tied to blood symbolism. Christian interpretation reads the red as Christ's blood on the cross. The older pre-Christian layer almost certainly read it as menstrual blood, birth blood, or sacrificial blood. Three interpretations of the egg's symbolism coexist. The fertility object view treats the egg as a self-evident symbol of new life chosen independently by many cultures. A diffusionist view sees the custom spreading from a single Indo-European source. A third view links egg symbolism to the Hindu cosmological concept of the Hiranyagarbha, the golden womb, from which the entire universe hatches, and proposes a Proto-Indo-European cosmogonic myth underlying all descendant traditions. The hare or Easter bunny association is equally ancient. The hare is a lunar and fertility animal across Eurasia. Aphrodite's sacred hare, Pliny the Elder's accounts of hare-eating rituals, and the three hares, motif found in Buddhist caves in China, Islamic ceramics, and English medieval churches, all derive from shared fertility symbolism. Fraser documented egg-rolling contests and egg-fighting games as surviving fertility rites in late 19th century rural Europe. Medieval Christian adoption of the egg as an Easter symbol is documented from the 13th century onward. Pope Paul V issued the Benedictio Ovorum in 1610, a formal blessing of eggs at Easter. The White House Easter egg roll has been held annually since 1878, when President Rutherford B. Hayes invited children onto the White House lawn. The egg rolling competition at Avenham Park in Preston, England, is documented from the 1830s. The late 19th century brought the chocolate egg. Fry's in Britain produced the first chocolate egg in 1873, Cadbury followed in 1875. By the 20th century, the chocolate egg had commercialized the spring ritual on an industrial scale. The Passover Seder plate, which includes a roasted egg representing mourning and rebirth, preserves the same spring egg logic in Jewish form. Every modern egg hunt is a ritual of finding hidden fertility symbols in the landscape, the ancient pagan spring game adapted for children's entertainment. Spring called back life. The solstice after it called back the sun. Number 10. The Druidic Yule Fire. At the winter solstice, on the longest night of the year, the ancient Celts and Germans lit fires against the dark. They cut evergreens and brought them indoors. They hollowed out yew branches to make torches. They selected a great log, anointed it with wine, salt, and oil, and set it to burn continuously for 12 days. They slaughtered animals, and according to the Roman witnesses of the period, they sometimes burned people inside woven structures called wicker men. Pliny the Elder, writing in his Natural History around the year 77 AD, described the Druidic mistletoe ceremony in detail. A white-robed priest climbed a sacred oak with a golden sickle. He cut the mistletoe from its host branch and caught it in a white cloth. It could not be allowed to touch the ground, or its virtue would be lost. Mistletoe was regarded as the all-aic, the all-heal, the most potent magical plant in the Celtic pharmacopoeia. 2 white bulls were then sacrificed at the base of the oak. Julius Caesar, in his Bellum Gallicum of around 52 BC, described Druidic human sacrifice. Others use figures of immense size, he wrote, whose limbs woven out of twigs they fill with living men and set on fire, and the men perish in a sheet of flame. This is the first written description of the wicker man. Tacitus, in his Germania of 98 AD, corroborated the account with descriptions of Germanic parallels. Strabo's Geographica of around 20 AD added that some victims were stabbed in the back, and the manner of their death throes was used for divination. 3 interpretations remain in tension. The sacrificial view, held by Caesar and his modern followers, treats the wicker man as a genuine mass sacrifice rite, performed at midwinter and at other key calendrical points. A propaganda view, argued by some modern historians, holds that the Roman descriptions were deliberately exaggerated to justify the Roman conquest of Gaul and Britain. A third view accepts that Druidic human sacrifice occurred, but questions whether the wicker man as described by Caesar was a specific practice or a dramatization of more varied rites. The Yule log itself is better documented. From the early medieval period onward, a great log was brought into the house with ceremony on the evening of the solstice. In some traditions, it was anointed with wine, salt, and oil. It was lit from the previous year's preserved ashes. Its own ashes were preserved to protect the household through the coming year. In France, as fireplaces shrank with industrialization, the Yule log transformed into a cake, the bûche de Noël, first documented in the 1860s. The Germanic 12-day Yule festival was moved to align with Christian Christmas by King Haakon I of Norway in 961 AD, according to Snorri Sturluson's 13th century Ynglinga saga. The nativity itself had been placed on December 25th in 336 AD under the Emperor Constantine, specifically to absorb existing midwinter festivals. The 12 Days of Christmas is the Yule festival structure preserved intact. The Christmas tree, in its modern form, appears in 16th century Germany and was popularized in Britain by an 1848 illustration of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert's family tree. Every Christmas wreath of holly and ivy, every kiss under mistletoe, every twinkling tree lit against the December dark is an unbroken line to the oak-climbing druid with the golden sickle. The burning of the clavey, performed every January 11th at Burghead in Scotland on the old Yule date, preserves the fire ritual itself, a blazing barrel of tar carried through the town by villagers and rolled down the hill. It has been performed without interruption for at least 300 years. Having traced 10 rituals from deep prehistory to the present day, a larger question comes into view. Why did these particular 10 survive? Across 2,000 years of Christianization and another 2 centuries of industrial modernity, when countless other prehistoric rituals disappeared without a trace? The answer lies in 3 mechanisms. First, rituals anchored to biological universals persist. Birth, death, pair bonding, seasonal change. These events require communal response regardless of theology. A wedding ritual can be stripped of its pagan symbolism and still fulfill the social function of joining 2 families. A funeral feast can be disconnected from its excarnation origin and still metabolize collective grief. The rituals that mapped onto these biological events were structurally necessary, and so they were preserved even as their meanings drifted. Second, Christian syncretism was official policy. In 601 AD, Pope Gregory I wrote a now famous letter to the abbot Mellitus, then leading the mission to England, instructing him not to destroy pagan temples, but to convert them. Temples were to be sprinkled with holy water, relics placed inside, and the old festivals were to continue, rebranded. This was not a concession to expediency, it was a considered strategy. Gregory recognized that rituals could not be abolished, only redirected. The result is that Christmas, Easter, All Saints, Candlemas, and virtually every other Christian festival landed on top of existing pagan calendar dates. Third, domestic ritual space preserved what public ritual could not. The church could suppress public temples, outlaw maypoles, and ban tattoos. It could not police every hearth, every kitchen, every doorstep. The Yule log burned in family hearths long after any formal pagan priesthood had died. Turnip lanterns sat on rural Irish doorsteps without any bishop noticing. Wedding cords were tied in village halls, not in cathedrals. Folk etymology carried ritual through language. Tying the knot. Seining, for blessing. Fortnight, from Germanic time reckoning. Children's games preserved ritual structures, egg rolling, bobbing for apples, maypole dances, blowing out candles, hide and seek, were prehistoric templates translated into nursery form. Paradoxically, commercialization has preserved structural ritual fidelity while gutting meaning. $12 billion Halloween, $100 billion Christmas, the chocolate industry's Easter, keep the ritual calendar in place and the ritual objects in circulation, even as the original theology vanishes. The commodity endures where the belief does not. And horror is the strongest preservative of all. The reason Halloween has persisted across Christian centuries and the Industrial Revolution and the digital age is precisely that it keeps the dead in view. Ritual lives where life remains at stake. That horror, however, has been steadily removed from the rituals themselves. The disappearance of ritual violence is itself a historical process worth examining. Christian-era reforms gradually substituted symbols for substances. Animal sacrifice gave way to the symbolic paschal lamb. Human sacrifice was replaced by effigies. The Wicker Man of Caesar's Gaul became the Guy Fawkes of England's bonfire night, the Zozobra of Santa Fe's burning of Old Man Gloom. The carnival effigies burned at the end of Lent across Catholic Europe. Each preserves the mass sacrificial logic while substituting straw and cloth for human bodies. Public executions in the pre-modern era functioned as a surviving ritual sacrificial space. Tyburn in London, the Place de la Grève in Paris, the scaffold in Boston Common were ritual theaters where the crowd gathered and the sanctioned killing proceeded according to established choreography. When these public executions ended in the 19th century, Western culture lost its last open-air sacrificial rite. Victorian reformers sanitized folk ritual aggressively. Fairy tales were rewritten to remove their original violence. Folk songs were bowdlerized. The sexualized Beltane rites of the 16th century became the innocent Maypole dance of the Victorian schoolyard. The feast while the corpse is processed of prehistoric Europe became the closed casket funeral reception, with the body safely embalmed and invisible, handled by professional morticians at a sanitized distance. The contrast with surviving non-Western traditions is striking. Mexican Dia de los Muertos keeps the corpse-adjacent feast alive, with families gathering at actual gravesides with food and drink. Tibetan sky burial still exposes bodies to vultures. Hindu cremation remains visually present, with bodies burned on ghats where passers-by can see them. Western modernity has systematically removed the corpse from public view in a way that deep prehistory never did. Tattoos are a rare exception. They preserve the blood and pain dimension of prehistoric initiation ritual in a form that remains recognizable to Ötzi. The modern tattooed person still submits to controlled pain, still emerges marked for life, still signals membership in a self-defined tribe. The ritual function survives almost intact, whether sanitized rituals still function as rituals, or whether modern societies have merely performed the gestures of their ancestors while losing the transformative efficacy that made those gestures matter, is a question the commercialization of every major Western holiday leaves partly open. A $12 billion Halloween is not the same thing as a Samhain, in which the dead actually walk. But the gestures remain perhaps precisely because the horror is still accessible underneath. All of these claims about prehistoric ritual rest on evidence, and the evidence deserves examination. How do archaeologists know what they know? The answer is often less direct than the confidence in popular summaries suggests. Preservation bias is the first problem. Most organic materials decay. Most wooden ritual objects, most leather cords, most feathered headdresses, most painted skin are lost. What survives is disproportionately stone, bone, metal, and whatever organic matter was accidentally preserved by waterlogging, freezing, or desiccation. Carr survived because its lakeshore deposits became peat. Ötzi survived because he froze. The bog bodies survived because of tannin and anaerobic conditions. Blombos Cave survived because of sand and coastal chemistry. The second problem is interpreting ritual from traces. Colin Renfrew's cognitive archaeology framework, developed in the 1990s, established criteria for identifying ritual in the absence of textual sources. Structured deposition, the deliberate placement of specific objects in specific locations, is one signal. Grave goods, modified human remains, architectural alignment with celestial events, and the repeated appearance of symbols in context without obvious practical function are others. DNA analysis has recently transformed the field. Ancient DNA studies allow kinship reconstruction within burial sites. Stable isotope analysis reveals what the dead ate and where they grew up. Use-wear analysis on stone and bone tools shows how objects were actually handled. Experimental archaeology, in which researchers replicate prehistoric techniques, tests whether hypothesized procedures actually work. Late antique and medieval written sources, Pliny, Tacitus, Caesar, Diodorus, Strabo, provide invaluable but ambivalent testimony. These writers were outsiders describing practices they did not themselves practice, often in hostile terms, often with political motives. Caesar's Wicker Man account may be genuine observation or may be conquest propaganda. Folklore functions as oral archaeology, customs preserved into the recent past and recorded by Victorian folklorists before industrialization could erase them, preserve practices that may be Bronze Age, Iron Age, or early medieval in origin. Fraser's comparative method has been heavily critiqued but produced lasting insights. Eric Hobsbawm and Terence Ranger's Invention of Tradition thesis, published in 1983, complicated the picture by showing that many ancient traditions were actually 18th or 19th century constructions. The honest answer is that different rituals are known with different levels of confidence. Ötzi's tattoos are known precisely because we have his body. Paviland's ochre burial is known precisely because we have his bones and the staining. Göbekli Tepe's Excarnation is strongly inferred from cut marks and iconography. The Wicker Man depends on Caesar's word. The deepest ritual facts remain opaque. What any of these rituals meant to their participants, their felt experience, their specific theology, is mostly lost. Many questions remain genuinely open. Whether Pillar 43 at Göbekli Tepe depicts a literal ritual or a mythological scene is unresolved. The Wicker Man problem runs deep. Roman historians' reliability is difficult to assess. The star Carr headdresses could be ritual regalia, hunting camouflage, or both, and the evidence does not cleanly decide. The geographic origin of handfasting remains obscure. Fraser's May King sacrifice hypothesis is unproven. Egg symbolism's deep origins are uncertain. The Celtic head cult's relationship to actual head display versus metaphorical skull imagery is contested. The relationship between Neanderthal and modern human ritual is an emerging question in paleoanthropology. The cave hand stencils of the Paleolithic, appearing from Spain to Indonesia, clearly carry symbolic meaning, but resist specific interpretation. The Venus figurine's function is similarly unresolved. Whether the passage tombs of Neolithic Europe, aligned with solstice sunrises at New Grange and Maypole, were temples, observatories, tombs, or some combination, remains disputed. And what rituals have left no trace at all, because their materials were all organic and their practitioners left no writing, will never be known. The honest scholar accepts that most of prehistoric ritual life is gone forever. What remains, however, is vast. The modern world is saturated with prehistoric ritual. Every tattoo is Ötzi's skin. Every wedding ring is the handfasting cord. Every jack-o'-lantern is a hollowed skull. Every Easter egg is a fertility offering. Every Christmas tree is an evergreen sacrament. Every funeral reception is a Göbekli Tepe feast. Every Halloween costume is a star Carr antler. Every baptism is a bog sacrifice in reverse. Every Maypole dance is a phallic ritual. Every mourning outfit is a red ochre shroud. These continuities are not metaphors, they are genealogies. Homo sapiens has been the same species throughout this entire span. Our cognitive architecture has not changed significantly in 40,000 years. The rituals we inherited were designed by brains structurally identical to our own. The persistence of these templates across 10,000 years and more points to a deep neurological substrate. Cognitivist archaeologists like Merlin Donald and Stephen Mithen have argued that ritual is not an accident of culture, but a cognitive adaptation, a technology for synchronizing large groups around shared attention, shared emotion, and shared memory. Rituals that worked survived, rituals that did not disappeared. The horror has been sanitized but never fully erased. The violence has been ritualized but never forgotten. Children still instinctively hide eggs, carve faces, dance around poles, wear masks, tie knots in string, burn candles, blow them out. These are not taught, they are retrieved. Each generation recognizes the gestures and accepts them without asking where they come from. The calendar we follow is itself a Neolithic agricultural timekeeper, marked by solstices and equinoxes and cross-quarter days that prehistoric farmers watched for their crops. The family meal is the distant descendant of communal feasting in the shadow of Excarnation pillars. The marriage ceremony is the knot tied with sacrificed sinew. The funeral is the red ochre on the Gower Peninsula. The birthday party, with its candles and cake and gift-giving, echoes seasonal and initiatory rites of pre-literate societies. The past is not another country. It is the infrastructure of our present. Every time we tie a ribbon around a Christmas tree, we are repeating a gesture whose original purpose was to mark the axis of the world. Every time we dye an egg, we are performing a blood fertility offering. Every time we blow out candles at a solstice dinner, we are enacting a drama of darkness and returning light. Every time we dress in black to bury someone, we are choosing a Victorian codification of a 30,000-year-old pigment tradition. The traditions survived because they worked. They worked because they met needs that remain unchanged. Humans still fall in love, still die, still need to mark the passage of time, still need communal joy and communal grief. We still gather. We still eat together. We still need to separate ordinary time from sacred time. The rituals our ancestors built for these purposes were effective enough, durable enough, and adaptable enough that 10,000 years and multiple civilizational transitions could not remove them. We have not progressed beyond them. We have simply forgotten them, while enacting their gestures every day.